Hello, everybody. I'm Howie Hawkins. I was the Green Party and Socialist Party's candidate for president in 2020. And this podcast, Green Socialist Notes, is about continuing to educate and advocate about the eco-socialist program that we ran on. And we got another crisis coming next week concerning healthcare that, we really need socialist solutions to. The Obamacare subsidies for people that buy their coverage on the market are going to expire. And what it's going to do is double or triple premiums for 24 million people. That means millions of people will not be able to afford their health care insurance anymore, and they're going to go without. And remember, the Democrats, wouldn't capitulate to the Republicans because they wanted a negotiation on solving this problem for this 24 million people whose premiums are going to skyrocket. And they finally caved with the promise from the Republicans that they negotiate in December. Well, it's December. Next week is the last week that Congress is in session. There's no solution on the table. The Senate voted down proposals this week. So it looks like the Obamacare subsidies are going to expire. And, so what do we do at this point? I mean, the Democrats are going to offer, Band-Aids to patch things up. The Republicans, you got their own Band-Aids, which will make things even worse. And I think as Greens, we got to just come forward with the real solution, which is a public health care program that's universal. Now, what's been on the table, Bernie Sanders really put this on the table, is national health insurance, which we call Medicare for all. But that's not enough. For-profit doctors, hospitals, drug companies, and everything from ambulances to long-term care and funeral services have been corporatized and monopolized by Wall Street investors. And they are, raising costs as it is. And if you set up a public insurance system, there's nothing to stop these for-profit entities from, feasting at the public trough that provides the insurance, that provides the payments. So what we need is a national health service, not just national health insurance. And when the healthcare crisis really began to be debated in the 1970s, there were three options. One was Nixon's plan, which was employer mandates and then some subsidies, actually expanding Medicaid. And that's basically what we got with Obamacare. And that, was an improvement. I mean, we got certain reforms like they can't refuse coverage because of pre-existing conditions. That's all good. But still, millions of people are underinsured, and many millions or more, tens of millions of people, are not insured. And tens of million people are underinsured. They take crappy plans, get hit with, what do they call it? What's the first thing you pay? You got to pay until you reach a certain level, and then they start covering you. I can't even remember the name of those payments, but anyway, it's expensive. Co-insurance? No, it's not co-insurance. It's your deductibles. First you got to pay for all that, and then they'll start covering you. The second plan that was covered was national health insurance, and Ted Kennedy was seen as the champion of that. And there was a third plan, which was the best. Ron Dellums, member of the Congressional Black Caucus, also Democratic Socialists of America way back, put forward a really good bill for a national health service. And this was written with the help of the Medical Committee for Human Rights, who had served the civil rights movement and then the anti-Vietnam War movement, patching up people that got beat by cops or shot by Klans people in the South. So they were activists and they were medical practitioners. And then also there was a program called the Health Pack Health Policy Action Center based in New York. And all these people were veterans of the New Left. And they came up with a National Health Service similar to, say, what Britain has, or Costa Rica has, or Cuba has, where the whole system, hospitals, doctors, clinics, drugs, are part of a public health program and publicly owned. And the people that work in it are public employees. They get a good salary, but they're not entrepreneurs like so many in the delivery end of healthcare are today. And what was better than anything they've got in Britain, Costa Rica, or Cuba is that they set up and this is, out of the New Left participatory democracy, they set up a structure of community control of a national health service. So you had local elected boards, 2/3 community people, 1/3 healthcare workers that were elected to administer local areas centered around community health centers. So communities of 25 to 50,000 would be the first level of this federated system of community control. And the importance of that is that we have healthcare deserts, like we got food deserts. And what this did was make sure every community had a community health center where you can get primary care. And then the next level, where the board elected locally, the boards would elect some of their members to the district board. And those are centered around general hospitals for populations of 100 to 500,000. And again, that would help deal with the problem of medical care deserts. And then the third level was the region, which would be centered around medical training and research centers, which would have hospitals. And those districts would be, or those regions would be serving a population of 500,000 to 3 million. And then finally, there was the national level that, again, was each board would elect the next board. And what the national level would do overall planning and medical research and allocate the funds generated by progressive taxation to fund the system on a per capita basis to the local, district, and regional boards, plus special grants for special needs. In other words, like if a community didn't have a community health center, you need more than just the per capita allocation. You got to build that center. So it would put, the whole system under public ownership: clinics, hospitals, drug companies, everything, long-term care, all of that. And then the doctors, nurses, and all medical workers would be public employees, accountable to the public through this democratic structure. And it would provide universal care for all medical services. So I'm going to have a few articles about this put in the chat. One of them is called Medicare for All is Not Enough, and it's by David Himmelstein and others who are active in Physicians for a National Health Plan. And see, what happened is a lot of these activists were supporting the Dellums plan, and then in the Clinton era, they decided they couldn't get a fully socialized system. So they just went for socialized insurance. And they started calling it single payer, presumably avoiding the socialist implications of a public program. And so they compromised and they tried to get that. And they didn't get anywhere with that. When Obama started doing healthcare reform, the Democrats in the Senate, which were putting the plan together, wouldn't even let the advocates for single-payer national health insurance testify. Sponsors of bills like John Conyers, who was sponsoring a Medicare for All bill at the time, couldn't even get to speak to the Senate hearings on this. People that were active in my campaign for president, like Margaret Flowers, who was a doctor and advocate, and Kevin Zeese, were arrested trying to speak from the floor in these hearings. I got arrested up here in Syracuse in that period, trying to just deliver a letter to, who was it, United Healthcare, telling them they should spend the premiums they get from their patients on the patients. And what they've been doing is withholding payments as a systematic policy so they could increase their profits. So they wouldn't take my letter, so I stood in the doorway and got arrested and spent a night in jail and ended up with, what was it? It's like 100 days community service. So, so we couldn't even get a hearing, and that's when the Democrats were in power. And the Dellums bill was dropped. Now, Dellums kept putting it in as long as he was still in Congress. That was through 1997. This change happened at the strategy decision to go with national health insurance was decided in I think it was the early 90s by, leading activists. And it was kind of not something that the grassroots activists decided. It was the people, the nonprofits. And and then they couldn't even get a hearing. So Dellums kept putting this bill in. His successor, Barbara Lee, put it in the form Dellums did the first time, or first session of Congress, but after that, she watered it down. So if you want to look up that National Health Service bill, go back to the Dellums bills from 1977 to 97. So the other two things we'll put in there is an article I wrote for Nader's Capitol Hill Citizen, It's Time for a National Health Service, which kind of summarizes what we're talking about. And at the end, since this newspaper is hand-delivered to all the congressional offices, I chide Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez for not putting the Dellums bill in and challenge her to, because she had said at a rally to, a lot of support. It was a rally for the VA, the Veterans Health Administration, which is a national health service for veterans. And she said we should have the VA for all. So I said, okay, back that up. I don't know if she ever actually got that. Staff tends to screen what people read, but it's at least there on the public record. And then the third piece we'll put in is my policy paper from the 2020 campaign, where I tried to co-opt Medicare for All. It was entitled Medicare for All as a community-controlled national health service. And I wrote that with Margaret Flowers, and it lays out what the system would look like, and then has a 10-year transition plan to, go from, to take over the hospitals and whatnot and plan out the system. And so at this point, I think that's what Greens should campaign for. Medicare for All is national health insurance. As we said in the 1970s, it was the great leap sideways, because the for-profit sector would feed at the public trough. And given the complete corporatization and shared monopolies in these sectors, Wall Street is invested all over the healthcare system, and all they care about is profits and squeezing as much money as they can out of the system. So they're just going to go to the public health insurance system and demand higher payments. And they got a lot of political weight to do that, as well as economic weight. So we need to socialize the whole system. So those papers go into that in more detail. And I think, this is going to become an issue, because a lot of people are about to get hammered and basically get priced out of any kind of health coverage or forced into such underinsurance that they might as well not have insurance. So that's a huge problem. Just note a couple things, or a few things going on now in terms of international policy. I think I talked about last week I did the national security strategy that Trump put out, which is as I said, make a Europe white again plan. And in the meantime, the U.S. is taking more actions against Venezuela. They seized a tanker this week. Trump openly threatened Colombia. In the past, he's threatened Mexico. And, in all these things I'm going to talk about internationally, Congress has got to act. And that's where we got to put pressure on our representatives. Congress can use the War Powers Act to pass a rule saying, or a law saying that we're not going to war with Venezuela. And we did that back in the 70s. We proscribed, in the early 80s, we proscribed war against Nicaragua. And that, of course, Reagan went around with the Iran-Contra scandal against war in support of South Africa, in Angola and Southern Africa. And again, Reagan went around that, CIA covert operations and, money to surrogates for South Africa, in particularly the war in Angola. But at least Congress took a stand and we had a law to hold them account to. Same thing with Palestine. The slaughter continues. The aid is not getting in. Israel has said the yellow line, I think they call it, that they've withdrawn to is now the new border of Gaza. So they basically control more than half of Gaza, and they say they're not going to give it up. Israel has got to be brought to account, and the U.S., who's been its biggest weapons supplier, we need an arms embargo on Israel. And Congress, there's legislation. We've talked about that before, and we need to keep pushing that and holding our representatives to account. And, so those are sanctions on Israel. We need sanctions on Russia that are real. Now, Trump made a lot of noise about supposedly sanctioning Russian oil, and the secondary sanctions against countries that were buying Russian oil were supposed to go into effect November 21st. That was all a big con job. In fact, India, China, and Turkey are buying more oil now than they were before. And so that was just a feint, while, Trump is lined up with Putin to tell Ukraine to give up the rest of the Donbass. Russia spent the last 3 years after the first year of the war, where they made a lot of gains and Ukraine made a lot of counter gains. The war's been basically frozen since then. Russia has, at the cost of over 1 million casualties, has gained about 2% more of Ukraine. And, to ask them to give up land, under the questionable promise that Russia won't keep attacking is ridiculous. There's been this bill for secondary sanctions on countries buying oil from Russia. It has 85 co-sponsors in the Senate. The gutless Republicans won't put it in because Trump hasn't given them the go-ahead. Trump's not going to give them the go-ahead. And we need to push members of Congress, the senators in particular, who have the 85 co-sponsors, to push that bill. At least we got to make it an issue while Trump is trying to force a peace settlement on Ukraine, which is really carving up the country between the U.S. and Russia. And I think the funny thing is, I think Putin's playing these real estate developers Trump has sent to negotiate. Stephen Witkoff and Jared Kushner and Trump himself, they think they can cut a deal with Putin so they can divide up the exploitation of Ukraine. But I think Putin's just going to play him along. He wants all of Ukraine. So, what we can do, I think, is push for sanctions. There's no hope of getting the U.S. to provide arms. The weight is now on Europe, and they are having a hard time getting their act together. So Ukraine is in a difficult situation, but, they keep defying the experts. Like in late November, as these negotiations are going on, Putin said, we took over Kupiansk, a fairly large city on the Donbass front line. And Zelensky was in there yesterday in Kupiansk doing a selfie video. So that was just a lie. It was propaganda from Russia. And they've been fighting over Pokrovsk for 18 months now, going on 19, and Russia keeps claiming they've captured it. And the fact is, there's a rail line going through the city. They have the southern part. Ukraine holds the northern part. So, all this narrative about Ukraine is losing and Russia will inevitably win. The purpose of that narrative, even though it's not true, is that it's to undermine support. Why give money to Ukraine if they're going to lose anyway, or give them arms? So that it's a false narrative, but it has a lot of effect. If you read the, mainstream media and a lot of the commentariat, they buy that Russian narrative, and the facts on the ground contradict it. So, to wrap up my opening comments here, let's talk about Mamdani as the mayor-elect of New York again. I've talked about, being sobered by the election results and underwhelmed by his program. He underperformed Democrats across the country on November 4th, which was a massive anti-Trump vote. But he didn't get the anti-Trump bump in New York City because that election was localized. Cuomo's campaign with Sliwa and Adams, taking the same position, was racist, Islamophobic, fear-mongering, and that hurt. But as I pointed out, Mamdani was the second member of DSA, Democratic Socialists of America, and a person of color to be elected mayor. The first was David Dinkins in 1989, and he got the same percentage, 50.4%. So, it's sobering. The racial politics of New York don't seem to have changed in 36 years. And then the program, the fast and free buses, the universal child care, and the rent freeze and rent regulated apartments are not really structural transformations of the capitalist institutions that create extreme inequality and public austerity in New York City. They don't change the balance of power between working people and capital. They're reforms that are in place all over the world. I mean, New Mexico just went for universal health care, although they may have some problems implementing it. But you've got it. I mean, and then take free buses or free public transportation. I mean, frontline cities in neoliberal Ukraine have it. All over Scandinavia, they have it. And we have it at least partially or fully in over 100 US cities. So it's not so much a structural change. And then the rent freeze, I mean, de Blasio got that 3 times. So I was underwhelmed by that. But I just wrote an article for New Politics. I submitted it yesterday. I was asked to write. And I call it a sobering but hopeful take on Mamdani's election. And I've just given you the sobering part. But I'm hopeful. I mean, the people that, over 100,000 people that knocked on, I think they ended up with 3.6 million doors and, 2 point something million phone calls and 1 million and something text messages. I forget the exact numbers now. I mean, they put in a lot of work. And that canvas moved voters, which is what a deep canvas where you take 10 or 20 minutes to really have a conversation with people, build rapport, and then talk about your program. That is the most persuasive form of campaigning that there is. One study found it was 102 times more effective in moving people views on a question than traditional canvassing, drive-by canvassing where you give the bio and the basic points of the candidate and then ask for how the voter's going to vote. And then who to mobilize on election day. That's just voter ID. TV and radio ads, signage, all the other forms of campaigning combined, deep canvassing is 102 times more effective. And those were 2 serious social scientists who came to that conclusion. So I think, that's one thing we should take away from the Mamdani campaign. And what's encouraging is a group of people in the campaign, independently of Mamdani's operation, which is now focused on the transition and then being mayor, are setting up an operation to continue to canvass for Mamdani's affordability agenda, which is good because Mamdani, he's in office, but he's not really in power. There are a lot of other power centers in New York City that are not happy with him. The real estate and Wall Street interests. I mean, in the first place, they don't want to pay progressive taxes. They on their personal income or their corporate income. So they're going to be resistant. And and then there's the police, which is a power unto itself. 50,000 employees. They can do work slowdowns, political strikes, and they're a voting bloc. So he's got a lot of other parts of the power structure to contend with. But I'm hopeful because of that, and DSA, which was the core of the campaign, did the initial organizing, brought the initial cadre, who then built out that 100,000 or more volunteer force. They are now campaigning for Tax the Rich, part of Mamdani's program. And they've had some success at the state level. They're basically reviving their Tax the Rich operation, which is good. So there are movements organizing to support Mamdani, and his success is important to us. Yeah, I don't like that he's a Democrat. I think that's a dead end. But the whole world is watching this experiment in municipal socialism, as moderate as the program was. I mean, I know friends in Ukraine in the left of a democratic socialist group called Sotsialny Ruch, or Social Movement. They had a webinar on what Mamdani means. I mean, and it's not just Ukraine, it's all over the world. You know, Zach Polanski, the new leader of the Green Party of England and Wales, is talking a lot about Mamdani. Everybody's watching that. And if Mamdani is successful in getting his reforms, as limited as they are, and maintaining popular support to a good degree, it's a foundation for further advances by municipal socialist movements. On the other hand, a failed example could set us back for years, because they'll say, look, we tried it with Mamdani and look what happened. So I said, you know, underwhelmed by the program, what kind of reforms would a real, you know, municipal socialist movement put forward that made structural changes, that took power from the capitalists and put it in the hands of working people through democratic public institutions? And I'll just list a few. And, you know, if you want in the question and answer, we can talk more about them. But public banking. If New York City has a public bank, then it can take all its deposits, put it in that bank, and use it to invest in priorities like affordable housing or clean energy, and financing its own debt. That's what happened in 1975 when New York was forced into facing bankruptcy, because Wall Street decided we're not going to refinance your existing debt, and New York was stuck. They needed a bailout, and what happened was the state put a lot of restrictions on New York. They basically took financial control of the city for a period of time, and so Wall Street holds a veto over what Mamdani might want to do. But with a public bank, you got your own financial power. Another thing is public power. Take over Con Ed and National Grid in the city and put them into a democratic public municipal utility that can prioritize moving the city to 100% clean energy, a Green New Deal for New York. Right now, Con Ed and National Grid are investing billions in refurbishing and then adding new gas infrastructure. So, and they want it, that'll last for decades. They want to make money off that for decades as they spew greenhouse gases into the atmosphere as the climate goes into serious crisis. Another thing is they passed a referendum in Berlin, Germany, for this, and that is to just expropriate the large landlords. They went with landlords with over 3,000 units. And the referendum calling for this passed 59% to 38%. Now, the problem there is the parties in power really don't want to take on the landlords who have a lot of power. So the people voted for it, but it hasn't been implemented. But that's an example of what we can do. That would take, landlords have enormous power, real estate generally, in municipal politics, because they make most of the investments, they contribute to the political campaigns. They're a real power. And but if you take some of that power from them, and what they wanted to do in Germany was expropriate those large landlords and put them into democratically managed public housing. And that would be offering affordable housing at cost rather than cost plus profit. So it'd make it affordable, and the rest of the private market would have to compete with that. So that's another thing we can do. In New York State, we have the stock transfer tax, which after the fiscal crisis in the 70s in New York City, they started rebating the tax to the traders. And that tax now generates upwards of $15 billion a year. And they, it's all on computers. They collect it and then they give it back to these traders. If they just kept that, it's 1/10 of 1% on a stock trade. It's a tiny sales tax. If they kept that money, that would go a long way toward funding, what Mamdani wants to do. And, Ralph Nader had a column out this week. I should have put that to be linked to. But he called Mamdani, the title is, he called him a moderate politician, which, is what I've been saying. And then he kind of, called out Mamdani because as a state assembly person, he did not get behind a bill that would have the state keep that stock transfer tax money and invest it in affordable housing and clean energy and mass transit. I mean, that was all in the bill. And Mamdani was AWOL on that. But that's something that, hopefully Nader's comment and this tax the rich campaign, people will pick up on that. And Mamdani now can just say he's for it. He can't vote for it because he's not in the state assembly anymore. But that's something that ought to pass. It just shows how much grip Wall Street has on New York politics, city and state. And then the last one I'll mention, and maybe I should have put this in the, put the link in. You can look it up on my campaign website, HowieHawkins.us. An article about community control of the police. I mentioned how the police have an independent power. Behind them is the real estate industry. They want the police to patrol the new Jim Crow of race and class segregation because they profit from it in so many ways, from displacement and gentrification, from an emphasis on building luxury apartments rather than affordable apartments, and then super exploiting communities that have extreme poverty. The real estate industry, makes money out of all those situations, and that's why they back, conservative policing. But with community control, where we would elect the police commission would appoint the police or hire and fire the police chief. It would have final word on discipline for police misconduct. You would have a police force that answers to the community rather than its own interests and the real estate interests. So those are all structural changes. I think those are the kinds of things when we run for local office, we should be raising. But I'm kind of hopeful that these movements will continue to back Mamdani. It'll be a success. And then we can build on it and expand the program to these structural changes I just talked about. So I'm going to stop there and see what you got to say. Falling Angel, any update on having Zach Polanski on the podcast? Thanks for reminding me. I New Politics wanted this article Monday, and it was my birthday, and I was getting calls. I spent the whole day talking to people, from comrades in Ukraine to cousins in Hawaii, as I went through the time zones. So I didn't finish it that day. Anyway, I finally got it to him last night. So that was preoccupied with that. But I will write to Zach and invite him to be on the podcast. I'm gonna say, do it when it's convenient for you, because I know you're busy. But thank you. Thanks for the reminder. I will pursue that this week. Scott 164. Any thoughts on secular talk saying how the economy in the U.S. is just gambling and scams now that we have AI and people finding corrupt ways to make money? I don't know exactly what was said on Secular Talk, which I guess is a podcast. A lot of the economy is gambling. There's it's financialization, so that instead of investing in production, they invest in assets that they hope will grow. Some of them are productive assets. Many of them are just bets on future values for the assets they're betting on. And crypto is kind of a pure example of that. and crypto scams. I mean, look at Trump and his family and the Witkoffs, his buddies. They've used the state to promote crypto currencies and coins to get the prices pumped up, and they can sell when it's high, and then the price comes down to earth. It's a scam. And AI, it's hard to get your head wrapped around that. I do believe we need to have a pause. I put that in the chat. There's a group calling for a pause on AI development so we can evaluate it, figure out how to regulate it, and use it so it benefits us, doesn't basically exploit us and perhaps take over from us. That's what some scenarios project. So the economy should be much more directed toward real production, and we should have an economy that plans producing enough so everybody has their basic needs met. So we share fairly what we produce, rather than now, which is oriented to endless growth, which is a disaster for the environment, which all speaks to why we need an eco-socialist economy that produces what we need within ecological limits, and that requires planning, not just relying on the profit motive in the market, where the incentives are to grow as without any limit. Scout 164. Trump is trying to stop states from regulating AI. Isn't that just sick that he wants it left alone despite all the damage it does, and contradicting his word of letting states handle things? Yep, it is sick. It is, contradicting the states' rights, rhetoric you get from Trump and the Republicans. And there was some, you say he is trying to stop states from regulating AI. I think there was some executive order or policy announcement this week from Trump. So it's more than trying. I think he took steps toward that. That's an issue we've got to get a handle on and get a real clear program about. And I'm still, trying to absorb, how we do that. Andrew Hager, Howie, do you remember last time I asked you about internet censorship bills and COSA? Fight for the Future has been saying that they are pushing for digital ID, are using child safety as a Trojan horse for government control of what we say, see, and do on the internet. Authoritarianism, internet censorship, and digital ID are a gateway to put us all at risk of data theft. And digital ID would risk a loss of anonymity and privacy rights for all users, for users of all ages. I really can't argue with what you're saying. All I know really is that Europe has regulations to protect the privacy rights of people online, which has limited what companies can do with your data. And we do not have comparable regulations. And I believe that's something we need. And again, this is another tech area where, the Greens got to get up to speed and have a program that, is effective and realistic. Scout 164, Zelensky is doing everything possible he can to fuck with Trump. He knows Trump is trying to kiss Putin's ass and refuses to let it happen before Russia can fall. Zelensky's smart. Maybe. I mean, he's also in a position where he has to kiss Trump's ass to prevent Trump from doing the last things he can do to hurt Ukraine, which is to stop sharing intelligence, which enables the Ukrainians to see where the Russians are coming from and, where they're launching their missiles and, fighter jets from and their drones. And the other thing is, he's still letting Europe buy weapons from the U.S. that can be passed on to Ukraine. He could cut that off too. So Zelensky's got to appease Trump without capitulating to Trump joining with Putin to carve up Ukraine between them. So I would say Zelensky is smart. I don't think he's doing everything he can to fuck with Trump because he still needs American intelligence and at least the right of Europeans to buy weapons for Ukraine from the Americans, and Trump can stop those things too, and really give Russia an upper hand on the battle lines. Scout 164. I don't even know why Trump wants money from Russia. People used to invest in Russia have said Russia never keeps their word, and everyone who works with them gets backstabbed. They won't get the money. Yeah, I think I put a link to the tweet by Bill Browder. He was the largest foreign investor in Russia in the late 90s and early 2000s. And then he started using his shareholder rights to try to curtail some of the corruption going on in companies he was invested in. And the crooks backed by Putin went after him. And, he had an accountant looking into this. The accountant was imprisoned and killed in prison. That was Magnitsky. You've heard of the Magnitsky Act, which enables the U.S. to sanction individuals involved in corruption and human rights violations. Now, Browder tweeted that, Trump and his, Kushner and Witkoff are going to be suckers because Putin's never going to let them make money in Russia. He's just going to, have them invest and then steal their money, and they'll never make a profit. And Browder, has experience with that. So, but Trump, he's had an obsession with Russia going back to the 80s and 90s. And we know in the early 2000s that Russia basically bailed his ass out after he, went bankrupt in the casino business, which is hard to do. And, invested in real estate that was laundering oligarchs' money, ill-gotten gains out of Russia, did the same sort of thing with Saudis. So, one of the problems with, the Russiagate investigation, what is his name? The guy that was, forgetting his name, who led that investigation. I'm just having trouble remembering names. But he was told by Rod Rosenstein, who was the acting Treasury Secretary, maybe Treasury Secretary by then, don't follow the money. Just look for collusion between the Trump campaign and Russia by other means. But it's the money where I think, the Russians have something on Trump. If nothing else, they're a pipeline for investment. So, yeah, Trump is entangled with Russia financially. He campaigned saying, I have nothing to do with Russia. And we found out he had a lot to do with it. His son spilled the beans at one point saying, we get all our investment money from Russia. So, Trump thinks he's going to make money from Russia, but I think they have played him all along. Scout 164, where is Putin getting money to throw propaganda around? with the decline of the oil sales and now shipments being droned, it's almost impossible to get anything out. No, actually, there's an article out by Phillips O'Brien today where he reports that, the people that keep track of this stuff say imports of Russian oil by China, India, and Turkey have increased since Trump's so-called sanctions. So the sanctions on oil have not really been implemented. Not by the U.S., not even by the EU. I mean, the EU countries have spent a lot more on Russian fossil fuels than they've given to Ukraine for its defense since the full-scale war started out. So, that is something for, the Ukraine Solidarity Movement in Europe to do, take on, and they're trying. So the oil is still getting out. The only real sanctions are the kinetic sanctions that Ukraine is imposing on Russia by its drone and missile strikes on Russian oil refineries, oil depots or fossil fuel depots, and now the port in the Black Sea, Novorossiysk or Ryusk or something like that, where Ukraine hit it. And, so, and then they've hit tankers, not when they're full of oil, but when they're on their way to get oil. So Ukraine is really imposing sanctions on Russia. And, the tragedy, the hypocrisy of Europe, who talks a good game about supporting Ukraine, and the U.S., which used to, but, Biden didn't really want strong sanctions on Ukraine because they want to keep oil prices on Russia. He wanted to keep oil prices low, at least until he got reelected. The fact that the U.S. never really provided full support for Ukraine. Ukraine would ask for weapons, and it would take months or years to get a particular weapon system. They were so afraid of escalation by Russia. Russia invaded, and Ukraine was defending itself. A lot of military analysts say if we had given Ukraine what it wanted in 2022, when it took back about half the land that Russia initially gained, particularly in Kharkiv and Kherson oblasts or regions, they could have continued and driven Russia out. But we didn't. Everything from artillery systems, fighter jets, tanks. We held back on all of that. We expected them to do it with bullets and shoulder-fired, anti-tank and anti-aircraft missiles. It was not really provided. It was enough, as a lot of people say, to prevent Russia from gaining more land, but not enough to throw Russia out and win the war. And U.S. leadership, the two major parties, have got to answer for that because they let the Ukrainians down, as they've let the Palestinians down. They've done nothing to defend, the Palestinians from Israel's onslaught. They're not really committed to international law and human rights. They're imperialist parties. They're capitalist parties. They're worried about, U.S. being able to make money all over the world. They support, anti-democratic leaders, like Biden was going to, distance himself from Saudi Arabia until he didn't, and so forth. It's the people running this country are a menace to the human race. Andrew Hager. With Trump giving orders to raid Venezuelan oil tankers, it seems the U.S. has officially has its own fleet of pirates. Yeah, that's what it is. It's piracy. There is no international law that gives them the right to do that. Now, I think I read that they claimed that oil was Russian oil, but I thought that tanker was leaving Venezuela, not going to Venezuela. So And why would Venezuela be importing Russian oil? I don't know. I saw that report and I haven't really thought much about it, but now that I think about it, doesn't make much sense. Sounds like something the U.S. would say as an excuse. Andrew Hager, speaking of Trump, what are your thoughts on his overall health and his chances of surviving the rest of his presidency? Well, he doesn't look good. He got those swollen ankles, that bruising on his wrists, which are indications of cardiovascular problems. So yeah, he. I'm not a medical person. I'm not a doctor. Can't predict, but he's not in good shape. But on the other hand, I mean, Dick Cheney had a serious heart attack in his late 30s, and he survived until what? He just passed away at his late 80s, I believe, early 90s. Something, did somebody in bad health you think would not be able to survive that long, but he did. So, and what's he getting those MRIs for? We don't know. Those are scans usually to find things like serious cardiovascular problems that need surgery or cancer. So, yeah, but just looking at him, he doesn't look that healthy. B.D. Dimmitt, Ray, Ukraine. The NATO did it crowd in the Greens should be calling for any U.S. peace plan proposal to include a line about the U.S. promising to close 90% of its extraterritorial military installations. Another about Russia getting back out of Crimea and eastern Ukraine and reopening non-proliferation and arms reduction talks about nukes. That's my plan, man. That's what the Greens should be calling for. And, I've written about this, that, while we help Ukraine defend itself, we should be going to Putin and saying, look, we're ready to reduce our nuclear forces. In fact, we'll take unilateral steps in that direction. Let's declare no first use. Let's declare we're paring down our nuclear force to the minimum credible deterrent. Let's close those anti-missile bases in Poland and Romania that Russia sees as a threat. They see it as a way to knock out Russian nuclear missiles in response to a U.S. first strike. And the U.S. said that was for Iranian missiles, which is kind of crazy. There are a lot of things we could do to build confidence, and then before the world, make it a public issue. The U.S. is ready for serious arms reduction talks and withdrawing extraterritorial military forces, by all powers. And that should be what we lead with and put Russia on the defensive about their militarization. They're spending 40% of their budget now on the military. They're doing all kind of provocative actions in the Baltic states and European states. They're flying balloons in. They're sending drones in. They're making quick airspace violations with fighter jets. They're doing cyber war. They're supporting sabotage. They're openly backing the far right parties in Germany and France and the UK. So they call that hybrid warfare. That should be negotiated too. But I agree. That would give Putin, like if we could say, if Putin could say, okay, I got arms control, I got the withdrawal of a lot of NATO forces from near our borders as both sides demilitarize. He could go back to Russia, the Russian public and his political elite and say, see, I got a good security arrangement for Russia. The problem, I think, is Putin is less worried about the security threat by NATO than he is about the example of Ukraine as a, democratic and prosperous country next to his, which is autocratic and, has a lot of economic problems. But I think that's the approach we should take. We should be, you know, saying we want to get a new intermediate range nuclear forces treaty. We want to get back into the conventional arms treaty, which Russia unilaterally withdrew from, so it could build up its forces outside Ukraine, and you know, on now they're building bases near Finland. There are little provocations going on in the Baltic states. There's the anti-ballistic missiles treaty, which Bush got out of in, I think, 2003. We need to get that back, and all that should lead toward the goal of getting all the nuclear powers, maybe U.S. and Russia leading the way because they started, to sign on to the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, which nearly 100 countries now, I believe, have signed on to. Unfortunately, none of the nuclear powers have. That's the kind of diplomacy and peace policies, you know, the U.S. should provide, and the U.S. should be, the Greens should be advocating. And, you know, the NATO did it, Greens, you know, I would say they're campus. They're in the camp of anybody that's opposed to the U.S., no matter how oppressive, imperialist, militaristic they are, like Russia. And that's sad. That's not the Green tradition. The Greens, going back to the German Greens when they formed, I mean, Petra Kelly was protesting the Euro missiles that U.S. put in the Poseidon or Polaris, one of those P's, missiles in Germany, and Russia was putting missiles. She protested in West Germany, and then she went to East Germany, got arrested in protest there. The Greens took a position, neither East nor West, but for the you know, for peace. And that, you know, that non-aligned position should be the Green position. We're for peace, not one camp of capitalist states versus another. Why are people asking for money from Saudi Arabia anyway? Well, Saudi Arabia's got a lot of money, and if you want to invest, and you can convince them to invest, what did they give? They gave Jared Kushner $2 billion for his company. That's why. They got the money, and you want the money? Ask them for it. That's what's going on. You know, Saudi Arabia gets, you know, a return on its investment. They share the profits, but that's why these people are asking for money from Saudi Arabia. They're interested in making money. They don't care, you know, how oppressive Saudi Arabia is toward its own people. Or in supporting, you know, talk about sub-imperialisms, you know, supporting one side in the Yemeni civil war. Or by some accounts getting involved in Sudan, which is really probably the most deadly war in the world right now. Scott 164. Any thoughts on Indiana refusing to let Trump flip the redistricting laws? Yeah. I mean, even Republicans in Indiana saw how, you know, brazen that was. And, you know, the plan that some Republicans wanted would have just eliminated all Democratic districts in the state, including the black districts around Gary, or district around Gary. So it was just so obvious that I think the Republicans said, you know, we'll get a backlash to this, so we're not going to go along with it. Okay, well, another hour has passed, and we'll be back here next Saturday. You know, the earth only knows what we'll be talking about then with all the crazy things the Trump administration is doing. But I hope everybody has a good week. I hope you are active politically. It does make a difference. And we'll be back here next week, and we'll see what's going on and talk about it. So have a good week, everybody.